This may come as a shock to most people, but this is a new finding that it's our sun and not carbon dioxide that determines Earth's climate. This is by Edmund Kontowski, founder at American Liberty Publishers. In fact, the cold period that's starting now will lead to a deep freeze in 2050 to 60 that will last about 50 years. The charts show clearly a weakened trend of sunspots in solar cycles 22, 23, and 24. These are the latest in a sequence dating from 1755, when extensive recording of solar sunspot activity began. We note that the peak of solar cycle 24, which occurred in 2014, is only about half that of solar cycle 22, which occurred in 2022, which had peaked at about 1989. This portends global cooling, not global warming. So there you go. Portends global cooling and not global warming. Sunspots are dwindling to lows not seen in 200 years. In 2008, during the solar minimum of cycle 23, there were 266 days with no sunspots. This is considered a very deep solar minimum. You can check out pictures of sunspots or their absence day after day for recent years at the link in this article, tinural.com. And you have pictures of suns with single sunspots region as the sun marches towards cyclical low expected in 2019-2020. We're there now. Sunspots have been observed for millennia, first in China and with a telescope for the first time by Galileo in 1610. Now we have a 400-year record of sunspot cycle observations, from which we can see a cycle length of about 11 years. Combining this fact with the discovery of a strong correlation between solar activity and radioactive carbon-14 in tree rings, it's been possible to backdate sunspot cycles from the sun's magnetic cycles for 1,000 years back to the Oort minimum in the year 10,010. Sunspots occur when magnetic field rips through the sun's surface, producing holes in the sun's corona, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, and changes in the solar wind, the stream of charged particles emanating from the sun. The solar wind, by modulating the galactic cosmic rays which reach the Earth, determines both the formation of clouds and the carbon dioxide level in the Earth's atmosphere, which has nothing to do with emissions from factories or automobiles. This is why in the 15 years prior to 2013, when humans produced 461 billion tons of carbon dioxide, compared to only 32 billion tons in the preceding 15 years, there was no global warming. In fact, the Earth actually cooled, despite the massive increase in carbon dioxide emissions. The fearmongers claim a doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide would produce catastrophic global warming, but Reed Bryson, founding chairman of the Department of Meteorology at the University of Wisconsin, has stated, quote, "You can go outside and spit and have the same effect as a doubling of carbon dioxide," end quote. After about 210 years, sunspot cycles crash, or almost entirely die out, and the Earth can cool dramatically. These unusually cold periods last several decades. Of greatest concern to us is the modern minimum, which ran from 1645 to 1715. Below is a chart that shows the paucity of sunspots during this period. Some years had no sunspots at all. The astronomer Sporer reported only 50 sunspots during a 30-year period, compared to 40,000 to 50,000 typical for that length of time. Since the modern minimum, a less extreme but still significantly below average period of cooler temperatures occurred during the Dalton minimum, that's from 1790 to 1830, also shown on the graph. At least as far back as 2007, before cycle 23 had bottomed, a Russian solar physicist predicted what we are seeing now. Professor Habibullo Abdusamatov head of the Pulkovo Observatory in Russia, noting that solar irradiance had already begun to fall, said a slow decline in temperatures would begin as early as 2012 to 15 and lead to a deep freeze in 2050-2060 that will last about 50 years. He said the warming we'd be witnessing was caused by increased solar irradiance, not CO2 emissions. Quote, "It is no secret that increased solar irradiance warms Earth's oceans, which then triggers the emission of large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere," italics added. So the common view that man's industrial activity is a deciding factor in global warming has emerged from a misinterpretation of cause and effect relations. Further debunking the very notion of greenhouse effect, the renowned scientist said, quote, "Ascribing greenhouse effect properties to the Earth's atmosphere is not scientifically substantiated. Heated greenhouse gases, which become lighter as a result of expansion, ascend to the atmosphere only to give the absorbed heat away." End quote. In a paper published in 2009, Abusamatov wrote that there have been about 18 Maunder-type minima of deep temperature drops in the last 7,500 years, quote, "which without fail follow after natural warming," end quote. And correspondingly, quote, "while in the periods of high sunspot maxima there have been periods of global warming, such changes in the climate of the Earth could be caused only by lasting and significant changes in the sun, because there was absolutely no industrial effect on nature in those times. We would expect the onset of the phase of deep minimum in the present 200-year cycle of cyclic activity of the sun to occur at the beginning of solar cycle 27, hence tentatively in the year 2042 plus or minus 11 years, and potentially lasting 45 to 65 years. And regarding analysis of ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, Abusamatov said, quote, "It has been seen that substantial increases in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global climate warming have occurred cyclically, even when there was as yet no industrial action on nature. It has also been established that periodic, very substantial increases in the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere for a period of 420,000 years never preceded warming, but on the contrary, always followed an increase in the temperature with a delay of 200 to 800 years. Hence, they were its consequence," italics and boldface added. Now, in an update in October 2013, Abusamatov warned, quote, "We are now on an unavoidable advance towards a deep temperature drop," end quote. Abusamatov's conclusions about global cooling came from his studies of the sun, but another scientist came to a similar conclusion by studying ocean currents. This should not be surprising, because as NASA has stated, quote, "Uneven heating from the sun drives the air and ocean currents that produce the Earth's climate." Okay, NASA said, the uneven heating from the sun drives the air and ocean currents that produce the Earth's climate. Well, that's logical. Don Easterbrook, a geology professor and climate scientist, correctly predicted back in 2000 that the Earth was entering a cooling phase. He made his prediction by tracing a consistently recurring pattern of alternating warm and cool ocean cycles known as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. He found this cycle recurring every 25 to 30 years for almost 500 years. Projecting this forward, he concluded, the PDO said we're due for a change, and that happened. Asked by CNS News about the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, Easterbrook said that, quote, "They ignored all the data I gave them. Every time I say something about the projection of climate into the future based on real data, they come out with some computer model data that says this is just a temporary pause. I'm absolutely dumbfounded by the totally absurd and stupid things said every day by people who are purportedly scientists that make no sense whatsoever. These people are simply ignoring real-time data that has been substantiated and can be replicated and are simply making stuff up. What they're doing in the United States is using CO2 to impose all kinds of restrictions to push a socialist government, end quote. Is it true that the global warming issue has become a front for a political ideology? Has it become a tool for increasing government control over our lives, not just in the US but all over the globe? In 2010, a leading member of the United Nations IPCC said, quote, "One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with the environmental policy anymore," end quote. Now, it's not about saving the environment, but about redistributing wealth, said Otmar Edenhofer, co-chair of the IPCC's Working Group 3 and a lead author of the IPCC's Fourth Assessment Report in 2007. He said, "We redistribute the world's wealth by climate policy," end quote. Edenhofer told the German newspaper outlet AZZ AM Sonntag, "Basically, it's a big mistake to discuss climate policy separately from the major themes of globalization. The climate summit in Cancun at the end of the month is not a climate conference, but one of the largest economic conferences since the Second World War. The Cancun Agreement set up a Green Climate Fund to administer assistance to poor nations suffering from floods and drought due to global warming. The European Union, Japan, and the United States have led pledges of $100 billion a year for poor nations up to 2020, plus $30 billion in immediate assistance. The IPCC regularly submits its reports to its expert reviewers panel, and as you might expect, most of its appointments to this panel have been supporters of global warming. A few non-believers have been included to give the appearance of balance, but their comments and questions have been routinely ignored as the IPCC focuses on what it claims to be the consensus view. Only one person has been on every IPCC expert review panel dating back to 1990. That man is Dr. Vincent Gray of New Zealand. He submitted a very large number of comments to IPCC drafts. Here are some of his comments from a letter he wrote March 9, 2008. Quote, "Over the period I have made an intensive study of the data and procedures used by IPCC contributors throughout their whole study range. Right from the beginning, I have had difficulty with this procedure. Penetrating questions often ended without any answer. Comments on the IPCC drafts were rejected without explanation, and attempts to pursue the matter were frustrated indefinitely. I have been forced to the conclusion that for significant parts of the work of the IPCC, the data collected and scientific methods employed are unsound. Resistance to all efforts to try to discuss or rectify these problems has convinced me that normal scientific procedures are not only rejected by the IPCC, but that this practice is endemic and was part of the organization from the very beginning. I therefore consider that the IPCC is fundamentally corrupt. The only reform, quote unquote, I could envisage would be its abolition. Yes, we have to face it, the whole process is a swindle. The IPCC from the beginning was given the license to use whatever methods would be necessary to provide, quote unquote, evidence that carbon dioxide increases are harming the climate, even if this involves manipulation of dubious data and using people's opinions instead of science to prove their case. The disappearance of the IPCC in disgrace is not only desirable but inevitable. Sooner or later, all of us will come to realize that this organization and the thinking behind it is phony. Unfortunately, severe economic damage is likely to be done by its influence before that happens." End quote. Patrick Moore, co-founder and director of Greenpeace, resigned because of its, quote, trend towards abandoning scientific objectivity in favor of political agendas, end quote. After the failure of communism, he says, there was little public support for collectivist ideology. In his view, a reason environmental extremism emerged was because world communism failed. The Berlin Wall came down, and a lot of peaceniks and political activists moved into the environmental movement, bringing their neo-Marxism with them, and learned to use green language in a very clever way to cloak agendas that actually have more to do with anti-capitalism and anti-globalism than they do anything with ecology or science, end quote. Václav Klaus, former president of the Czech Republic, university professor before he became president, is the author of a book on global warming and has spoken often on the subject. He says, quote, "What frustrates me is the feeling that everything has already been said and published, that all rational argument has been used, yet it does not help. It does not help because global warming alarmism is not based on rational argument, it's not based on science, it's not based on reality, it's based on political ideology. If rational argument doesn't fit, then phony arguments must be invented. The spread of malaria, the loss of biological diversity, oceans flooding, polar bears disappearing, Himalayan glaciers vanishing, etc. If global warming does not fit the observable temperature measurements, then a new reality must be invented to fit the ideology. Actual temperature records must be altered or dismissed. Hundreds of temperature reporting stations in colder areas worldwide are eliminated from the global network so that average temperature is higher than when those stations were included in the link. Presto! Global warming. Ditto for carbon dioxide measurements. 90,000 CO2 measurements in 175 research papers were dismissed because they showed higher CO2 levels than desired, and various other studies were selectively edited to eliminate uncooperative measurements while claiming the cherry-picked remaining ones showed global warming link. The global warming advocates are not disturbed by all this because, in their view, ideology trumps reality. Klaus states, quote, "We succeeded in getting rid of communism, but along with many others, we erroneously assumed that attempts to suppress freedom and the centrally organized mastermind and control society and the economy were matters of the past, an almost forgotten relic. Unfortunately, those centralized urges are still with us. Environmentalism only pretends to deal with environmental protection. Behind their people and nature-friendly terminology, the adherents of environmentalism makes ambitious attempts to radically reorganize and change the world's human society, our behavior and our values, and they don't care about resources or poverty or pollution. They hate us, the humans. They consider us dangerous and sinful creatures who must be controlled by them. I used to live in a similar world called communism, and I know it led to the worst environmental damage the world has ever experienced." The followers of the environmentalist ideology, however, keep presenting us with various catastrophic scenarios with the intention of persuading us to implement their ideas. That's not only unfair but also extremely dangerous. Even more dangerous, in my view, he says, is the quasi-scientific guise that their oft-refuted forecasts have taken on. Their recommendations would take us back to the era of statism and restricted freedom. The ideology will be different. Its essence will nevertheless be identical. The attractive, pathetic, at first sight, noble idea that transcends the individual in the name of common good, and the erroneous self-confidence on the side of the proponents about their right to sacrifice a man and his freedom in order to make this idea a reality. We have to restart the discussion about the very nature of government and about the relationship between the individual and society. It's not about climatology, it's about freedom, end quote. Much of the foregoing is a bridge of my earlier article. He says, "It's the sun, stupid." Some of the other articles I have written on global warming can be found, and he says here, this first was posted on American Liberty, and it's on Blog Heartland, and by Edmund Kontowski, founder at American Liberty Publishers. He's a former director of planning for internationally renowned environmental consulting firm doing business in more than 40 countries. He's been an urban planner, held responsible positions with major real estate development companies, and also he has lectured widely on international monetary issues and done economic research on a variety of subjects, including world trade. He's the author of 3 books, including award-winning Makers and Takers, How Wealth and Progress Are Made and How They Are Taken Away or Prevented, and The Trojan Project, a novel of political intrigue that deals with the restructuring of the United States government. His latest book, The Impending Monetary Revolution, The Dollar and Gold, updated in 2nd edition containing 6 additional chapters. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.